Welcome everyone, and thank you again for joining. My name is Stephanie Wolf, and I am the Membership Relations Coordinator at Population Connection. It's so great to have so many of you tuning in for our first virtual event of 2025. And to kick off our events, we are thrilled to have Nandita Bajaj on the call today. Nandita is the Executive Director of Population Balance and the co-host of the Overshoot podcast. In addition, she is a senior lecturer at the Institute for Humane Education at Antioch University. Now, if you have any questions for Nandita, please drop them in the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen. We will do our very best to answer those questions along with the pre-submitted questions during the Q&A session facilitated by our senior analyst, Hannah Evans. And for any questions we don't have time to answer, we will provide written responses along with a recording of this presentation, the presentation slides, and access to the chat box discussion. Now, those are all the housekeeping items from me. I am looking forward to today's event, and I will go ahead and send it over to you, Nandita, to get us started.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, and thanks so much to the team at Population Connection for having me. We were fortunate to have hosted your team on the Overshoot podcast just a few months ago, so it's really lovely to be collaborating. And my topic today that I'm discussing is about population denial within the UN, specifically within the UNFPA. And this is such a frustrating topic because population denial is rampant in media and academic circles. And to see the leading agency responsible for reproductive and sexual health and rights to be engaging in the same kind of rhetoric is extremely worrying and very frustrating. So I will be discussing that along with some strategies of how do we move beyond population denial. I'm going to be specifically discussing a report that my colleagues and I wrote. It's a research paper. And there will be questions later on, time later on for Q&A. So I look forward to engaging with all of you then. So I'm going to just share my slides. And I'll start just a little bit about population balance, where I work. I'm the executive director there. We inspire narrative, behavioral, and system change that shrinks our human impact and elevates the rights and well-being of people, animals, and the planet. So specifically, we look at the ideologies of pronatalism, human supremacy, growthism, technological fundamentalism, and offer life affirmative pathways to get out of the ecological and social crises we find ourselves in. We publish media articles to challenge this kind of denial and growthism within media. We publish academic papers and book chapters. We present like I am right now, at conferences, groups and colleges, schools, etc. And I offer the only course of its kind on pronatalism, overpopulation, and the planet, the personal, cultural, and global implications of having a child, which is a 3-credit open online course, a discussion-based course that is open to anybody in the world. And we recently changed the name of our podcast. So a lot of people might be familiar with the Overpopulation podcast, which has been called that for about 8 years. And we recently changed the name to Overshoot to capture the broad context of the things that we discuss, of which overpopulation is a part. We also recently started another podcast called Beyond Pronatalism, Finding Fulfillment with or Without Kids, where we interview individuals and couples about the creative ways in which they are challenging pronatalism and redefining kinship for themselves. And here's to today's presentation. I will cover it in 3 parts: UN and Overshoot, how they are related. How does population denial show up within the UN, specifically the UN Population Fund? And then briefly, pathways forward towards social and ecological justice. So to begin, my talk today is based on a paper that my colleagues Eileen Christ, Kirsten Stade, and I wrote. And that paper was published right in line with the 30th anniversary of the International Conference of Population and Development, which took place in 1994, which will also be the subject of some of my slides today. And the paper is called Confronting the United Nations Pro-Growth Agenda, a Call to Reverse Ecological Overshoot. So with the UN and overshoot, very briefly, the UN was founded in 1945, just after the Second World War, to promote world peace and collaboration among nations. However, during its founding, it was influenced heavily by the prevailing ideas of the time, which were that economic growth brings prosperity and well-being, human ingenuity can overcome all constraints to growth, and nature and non-humans exist as resources to serve us. Today, 80 years later, we find ourselves in extremely worrisome social and ecological crises and extreme overshoot. And the UN, unfortunately, appears invested in this obsolete framing as things become even more desperate. In terms of where we are today, we are in a state of ecological overshoot where we are demanding 75% more than the planet can sustain and regenerate. During the last 200 years, our population grew eightfold, from 1 billion to 8 billion. While for 99% of our history, the population remained below 5 million. So what we've seen in the last 200 years is unprecedented. It's abnormal for any species to do this without facing incredibly harmful and devastating consequences. In the same amount of time that we grew by 8, a factor of 8 in our population, our consumption grew by a factor of 100. And that consumption and that population growth have been distributed unequally around the world. Regardless, the combination of the two has led us into our current crises. We are in a state of what's known as the Great Acceleration, where many different aspects in terms of pollution, energy use, agriculture have all increased lockstep with our population over the last 200 years, but specifically over the last 70 years, since 1950. Scientists are saying that population growth combined with imperialism and extractive relationship with nature are resulting in the state of overshoot, which is a meta crisis. Overshoot includes climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss, disease, social inequality, resource scarcity, and so many more things. And in terms of what we have done to nature and non-humans, the results are staggering. Other species have been going extinct at alarming rates in lockstep with the rise of human population, so much so that our biomass, in terms of all the mammals that are alive, the animals that we kill for food represent 60% of all that biomass. 36% of the total biomass is us humans, and only 4% of the total biomass is free living beings, so wild animals. 10,000 years ago, before we started engaging in domestication of animals and plants, these numbers were totally flipped. We represented 1% of the total biomass, and the wild world, the free living world, was 99%. So it's really staggering what we have done to the planet. And of course, because we are one of the many animal species, we've also done that at our own peril. This short video just shows what has happened with the founding of the UN over the last 80 years since it's been around. And it's just a quick video.
The Second World War brought some of the greatest loss of life in human history. In its aftermath, the United Nations was born with the goal to never allow such destruction to happen again. The world's population entered a period of unprecedented growth, from about 2.5 billion in 1950 to over 7 billion today. During the 7 decades of the UN, the growth of our population created new challenges, from urbanization to aging population to migration. The United Nations has been engaged in population issues since its early years. The first World Population Conference in 1954 in Rome launched international cooperation between countries on demographic issues. It was followed by conferences in Belgrade, Bucharest, Mexico, and Cairo. Today, the UN provides analytical expertise on issues regarding population. Working together with the United Nations, countries are preparing for the great demographic transformations ahead to ensure a better future for all.
So that history was important to understand, that when the UN was founded, there was a lot of discussion about population and demographic changes. As you saw in the video, there's a strong recognition that population growth was unprecedented. It was creating all sorts of challenges environmentally, with human rights, with poverty, etc. And yet, over the last 20 to 30 years, that discussion on population has completely gone missing, so much so that today we're actually seeing reports coming out of the UN saying population doesn't matter at all. And there's a reason why that shift happened. And it specifically took place in the 80s. And folks who are familiar with the Reagan administration and the many conservative religious ideologies that came with that, including the global gag rule, which prevents any US agencies from providing support to organizations around the world who are working on abortion rights, which gets reinstated every time a Republican Party comes into power, and has happened again just last week. But also with the Reagan administration came not just religious thinking, but also market fundamentalist thinking, that we should not only not talk about sexual and reproductive health and rights, abortion, contraception, but also we should be promoting development and market forces, really to open up trade practices in an effort to exploit the countries with resources. And very unfortunately, that narrative entered the UN discussion. And I'm providing an extremely brief explanation of that. But at the 1994 Cairo conference, a really bizarre confluence of feminists, religious leaders, including the Vatican, including Islamic leaders, as well as market fundamentalists, people who believe that market forces will solve all of our problems, and economic growth is necessary for prosperity and well-being. They all came together and united in deciding that population was no longer okay to talk about. While we understand and side with the concerns of the feminists that there were a number of policies that were put into place in countries such as India, where I'm from, in China, and a number of other countries such as Puerto Rico, where coercive reproductive measures were put into place to reduce population growth in those countries. And those are right concerns for feminists to have. What was missed at this conference and totally dismissed was the number of voluntary family planning programs that were far more in number than some of the coercive methods that were talked about in this conference. And so, interestingly, religious leaders were interested in not promoting contraception and abortion. That's their self-interest. Market fundamentalists wanted the population to grow because, according to them, population growth leads to economic growth. It leads to cheaper labor. It makes it easier to exploit disempowered, impoverished people. And so it was a very bizarre confluence where the most progressive and the most regressive people agreed on one thing, that we will not talk about population again. And to understand this history a little further, I recommend listening to our podcast episode with Diana Koo, who's done a really deep dive into how this came to be. But today, I'd like to show really how that shows up. In neglecting the population factor within our unraveling ecological and social crises, the UN, especially the UNFPA, basically aligned with its founding principles that growth is necessary, it's good, and that we are so clever that we can figure out our way out of all of these crises. I'm going to play a very short clip by our advisor, Dr. Bill Rees, who explains how this notion of growthism has become so normalized over the last 200 years.
I think it's really interesting to look historically at this whole question of growth, because for all intents and purposes, there was none for 250,000 years. In just the last 200 years, we've seen more change than in the previous entire history of human beings. Only 10 generations of human beings out of thousands have experienced this phenomenon of growth. Growth in population, growth in technology, in sufficient quantity so that they would notice in the course of their lifetimes. And so it's really a very, very recent phenomenon. But because all of us alive today and for the past few generations have been embedded within this growth dynamic, we take it to be the norm. And therefore, we project ourselves into the future as if it can continue forever. But the fact is that this is the single most abnormal period in human history. It's completely unprecedented, never occurred before, and can never occur again.
And unfortunately, given the prevailing ideas of the time of its founding and today, the UN seems even more invested in the idea of economic growth, as we also see in the development of its oxymoronic phrase, sustainable development. Sustainable development especially within the English language, implies growth. And sustainable and growth do not go together. So you can also understand from this perspective why the UN, year after year, decade after decade, continues to miss all of the goals that are laid out in the SDGs. And so now population denial in the UNFPA, how that shows up. So I'm going to focus specifically on the most recent report that was published by the UNFPA. And it was published in 2023, right after the population reached 8 billion. And the report is glibly called 8 Billion Lives, Infinite Possibilities, the Case for Rights and Choices. And as I unpack some of the themes that are present in the report, I was made to really question what infinite possibilities means here. Infinite possibilities, really, for me, I think of infinite possibilities of suffering, because I don't see how continued population growth, especially when you understand on whose backs that population growth is happening, how that could ever be used as a celebratory thing. So first instance in the report is a public survey that was conducted by YouGov. It was commissioned by the UNFPA, and it had a representative sample of 8,000 people. And the question really was, what are people's views on population? And the people were represented from 8 different countries: Brazil, Egypt, France, Hungary, India, Japan, Nigeria, and the US. And the survey results were shared with us. And so here, respondents' views on fertility rate and population size across 8 countries that were surveyed were that the population was too high for the majority of the people, as you can see. The global fertility rate was too high. The world population, as well as their country population, was too high. A small minority of people thought that it was either too low or just right. But majority of people thought that both fertility and population were high. Okay, and then the UNFPA's report decides to do an interpretation of the results. The findings suggest, according to them, that the population anxieties have seeped into large portions of the general public. In every country surveyed, the most common view among respondents was that the global population was too large. Focus here on population anxieties have seeped into the general public. In all countries, those who reported being exposed to media or conversations about the world's population in the past 12 months were substantially more likely to view the global population as being too high. And then the alternative response here was people who thought that they didn't know what the right answer was. These are people who had no exposure to media. And so according to the report writers, people are being indoctrinated by the news to believe that the population is too high. So these are self-reported results. This is what people say they believe is happening in their own countries. And this is what the UN believes that people are just being, convinced or influenced by ideological news about the crises occurring or the alarmism about climate change or biodiversity loss, etc. Now, is it surprising also that people who were interviewed happened to be from, especially 7 out of the 8 countries are among the 25 most populous countries? So is it a surprise that people within those countries think that their population is too high, that there is overcrowdedness, that there is lack of opportunity, that there is pollution, that the standard of living is too low? So that was really concerning that there was such selective interpretation of those results. Another quote from this report: too many people. This phrase is uttered every day. It can be heard among drivers sitting in traffic. It may be spoken by shoppers in long queues for groceries and by consumers of news about the plunder of natural resources and rising global temperatures. From their perspective, a world of 8 billion human beings is one bursting at the seams. Consumers of news, again, makes its way into their reporting, that somehow people who are paying attention to the news are being indoctrinated about all of these ecological crises that are happening. So my question and our question for my colleagues who wrote the report is, if the rights of people are so central to the UNFPA's values, why are their views and their self-reported experiences constantly being dismissed and belittled? Who should these people believe, if not their own experiences or what they're seeing in the news. The other thing that is constantly reported in media, but sadly also within the UNFPA report, was that we are headed toward a fertility decline. It is such a good thing that overpopulation is not really a problem because fertility rate has declined from 2% in 1970 to 1% now. So what is all this alarmism about population growth? Well, its own other agency, the UNDESA, also reports on how the population is actually continuing to grow. And just because the fertility growth rate or the population growth rate has declined, it's still growing. It's only the rate that has declined. In 1970, the growth rate was 2% and the population was just 4 billion, meaning we were growing at 80 million people each year. We have now more people in 2020, and even though the growth rate is only 1%, we are still growing at the same rate as the blue line shows, 80 million people a year. So the other thing that was brought up is the idea that fewer people would automatically relieve pressures on the planet and allow ecological restoration is persistent. Proponents of such thinking often link human population size to food insecurity, soil degradation, biodiversity loss, plastic pollution, the increased chances of pandemics, overcrowding, joblessness, deteriorating infrastructure, bad governance, and conflict. Very interestingly, for every single thing that's mentioned here, we were able to find in our paper evidence from other UN agencies that literally linked population growth to all of the things that are listed here. And here I only present a couple of the main ones, where UNDESA talks about how the growing urban population presents challenges for housing, transportation, infrastructure, etc. The IPBES talks about how since 1970, because of increase in population growth, there is more agricultural demand, there is more energy demand, there is more technological development, and all of that has come at the expense of biodiversity and soil health. And similarly, UNICEF and World Bank talk about how rapid population growth, specifically in countries that are experiencing really high fertility rates, also have the highest number of extremely poor children. So not only is the report eliding a lot of the scientific evidence that is being produced in peer-reviewed journals, it's actually neglecting the scientific evidence from other UN agencies. Similarly, there is this statement from the Union of Concerned Scientists that's quoted within the report. A misplaced focus on population growth as a key driver of past, present, and future climate change conflates a rise in emissions with an increase in people, rather than the real source of those emissions, an increase in cars, power plants, airplanes, industries, buildings, and other parts of our fossil fuel dependent economy and lifestyles. Interestingly, its very own agency, the IPCC, scientifically proved that both GDP per capita and population growth remained the strongest drivers of CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion in the last decade. So it's not any kind of a misplaced focus on population growth. Population growth is a key driver of climate emissions and climate change. Often what's brought up, and this was also brought up in the report, was the disproportional consumption patterns of people in high-income country. And that is a legitimate issue. The gross overconsumption of people in high income and wealthy country, especially the elites, has caused a disproportionate amount of contributions to climate emissions. And you can see here that people living in the US, for example, an average citizen, at their level of consumption, we would need 5 Earths. And if everyone lived like a person in India, where still there is extreme poverty among many, many people, we would need only 0.8 Earths. So that is a legitimate issue that absolutely needs to be addressed. But to say that consumption is the only thing that matters, and consumption in rich countries is the only contributor to our ecological crises is inaccurate and neglectful of the reality. The reality is that 75% of the people live in the global south, or what we consider to be global south countries, and only 25% live in the global north. The assumption that 75% of the people are not contributing as much to some of these ecological crises, especially, there's such a bias within also the UNFPA that climate change is the only issue that we're experiencing. I spoke about the human supremacist worldview, that nature is just there for us to use as resources. There's no mention at all about the 6th mass extinction that we're experiencing, the staggering loss in biodiversity. The only issues that are talked about are those that concern human beings. But the idea, to go back to my point, that 75% of the people are not really having that big of an impact, therefore if population continues to grow, it's not really a big deal, assumes, number one, that people who are living that way, meaning in substandard living conditions, are choosing to live that way, that they also don't want to increase their level of consumption, travel by airplane, own cars, eat animal-based diets, all of which are increasing at shocking levels around the world. In fact, the global middle class, 90% or 88% of the next billion people who are joining the global middle class are coming from Asia. 380 million in India, 350 in China, and the rest of Asia represents the rest of that percent. So that number, those two numbers are equivalent to adding 2 additional USAs to our consumption patterns. So to assume that people are choosing to live poor lives and are not going to take every opportunity to increase their level of consumption, as they should from a social justice perspective, is extremely condescending. In addition, the global middle class market is growing more slowly in advanced countries and more rapidly among emerging market economies, specifically in China and India. Another quote from the report, many real challenges are waved away with a simple, nihilistic verdict. If global catastrophes are the result of too many people, the logical assumption that follows is that the number of people must be reduced, that some unknown number of people should survive and reproduce, while others should not. Now, folks who are working on sustainable population advocacy should find this extremely offensive, because what's being conveyed here, that number one, we are nihilistic, we do not like human beings, and that we are advocating to restrict the reproduction of some people and possibly even culling other people that's what it makes, that's what I get from should survive. So is really that, is nihilism really the right response for people like us who are trying to advocate a sustainable population for the well-being of all? So a lot of misstatements, but also unsubstantiated. There's not a lot of evidence to show where this is coming from. I do have a sense that there has been a rise in antinatalist rhetoric, and also this notion that human beings are a parasite on Earth and that we should just voluntarily go extinct. And as media narratives tend to do, they love extreme responses. And I fear that antinatalism and voluntary human extinction rhetoric has been gaining more strength in media narratives, especially if you are a growth-biased journalist. It's a really good angle for you to say, well, look, these people are all antinatalists. They don't want people to have kids. And they think that we are so terrible that we should go extinct. And that is unfortunate because that is a misrepresentation of the work that so many of us do for very positive human life that is in balance with the rest of life on Earth. And I will speak briefly about pronatalism in a bit, but I did want to say that there is this notion that if you are challenging pronatalism or the pressures to have children, you're automatically advocating antinatalism. Again, it's the binary thinking, the lack of nuance in our media rhetoric that produces this kind of a response, but neither pronatalism nor antinatalism actually lead to reproductive autonomy. And at least at Population Balance, we reject both those ideologies. For us, both reproductive autonomy and responsibility are essential for healthy exercising of rights. Rights of people, but also the rights of children, the rights of other species, the rights of nature. Another thing that appeared was very selective examples in history. On one of the sections, they talk about too many, too few, the long history of population debates. Interestingly, the history doesn't go far enough back into when the population debate really started. So according to Angela Saini, who wrote The Patriarchs Whom We Interviewed on our podcast, patriarchy, which started about 5,000 years ago, was the beginning of the institutionalization of pronatalism, because population growth was essential for elites in early societies. As she says, elites needed population growth to strengthen their states. Young women were expected to produce as many children as possible, and men were expected to fight in wars to protect the state. Family arrangements and gender roles were codified in service of the state. And she found in her research that prior to this, there are many examples, even they exist today, of egalitarian societies where the power distribution is not so skewed and gender roles are not so rigid. But given that patriarchy really was the start of pronatalism in terms of institutionalization of it, and that patriarchy in the form of religion, in the form of nation states, militaristic states, rely on people to strengthen their institutions, that part was not included in the report. Instead, it's assumed that all the decisions that we make are made in a vacuum, that when people in a country where the total fertility rate is 7, when they are asked how many children they want, and they say 6 or 7, that should be believed at face value, that social norms and patriarchal restrictions have no effect on people's preferences for family size. In fact, pronatalism is so pervasive, and it has been for 5,000 years, that we have come to see it as completely normal. Cultural pressures show up in media, from our families, from TV shows and songs, advertisement, that motherhood is destiny, and that having children and having many children is a very good thing. Religious pressures show up in the form of statements such as "go forth and multiply," "the purpose of marriage is to have children," "it's a sin to be childless," corporations and economies depend on more consumers, and politicians depend on more taxpayers, military, and more ethnocentrism that drives them to push people to have more children. And here are some examples of what that looks like, especially as fertility rates are starting to decline in many countries because of greater gender equality, poses a threat to the patriarchal values on which these nations are founded. So from Iraq, lowering marriageable age of girls to 9 years, to Hungary, exempting people from paying income tax if only they would have 4 children for the country, to what's happening in the US with the growth in abortion bans and sanctions on contraceptives, only to ensure that people will continue to have children, regardless of what they want. We know that 650 million women and girls alive today were married before their 18th birthday. That's pronatalism. We know that nearly half of pregnancies are unintended. That's pronatalism. And we know that over 200 million women and girls have an unmet need for modern contraception. And a lot of folks like to say, if only we made contraceptives available for free, we wouldn't have a population problem. Why don't we do that? That is an inaccurate statement, because unmet need here means that there are psychological barriers that prevent people, especially women, from accessing contraceptives. They may have contraceptives available for free, but the fear of being beaten up by their husband, of being punished by their in-laws, of being divorced, being ostracized, being economically marginalized, all of those are the reasons there's an unmet need for contraception. That's pronatalist pressures that are preventing people from realizing their reproductive needs. And this presentation would be incomplete without the mention of Elon Musk, the richest, most powerful man on earth, who now has control over the US policies, who thinks that population collapse due to low birth rates is a much bigger risk to civilization than global warming. And according to him, the urge to have sex and procreate has been subverted by birth control and abortion, leading to population decline. Another really huge influencer with 1 billion followers, Pope, according to him, we see a form of selfishness, that some people do not want to have a child. Sometimes they have one, but that's it. But they have dogs and cats that take place of children. Matt Schlapp, who is the chairman of the American Conservative Union, believes that if you say there is a population problem in a country, but you're killing millions of your own people through legalized abortion every year, well, if that were to be reduced, some of that problem is solved. And that's what we're seeing happening in the US and so many countries where forced birth practices are being exercised. According to Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, we will defend Christian culture and will not surrender the country to aliens. Instead of just numbers, we want Hungarian children. Migration for us is surrender. I have probably 100 quotes like this. I just chose to show 4 in the interest of time, but all of the folks who are talking like this happen to be men. There are some women, and it's the same message over and over again, that if only we take away rights from women, if only we restricted and put women back in their place and men back in their place as protectors, we could go back to the good old days. So I've written this many times, but as a reminder, because so many people who are engaging in population denial like to use the word population control to relay what organizations like Population Connection and Population Balance are trying to do in advocating for smaller populations, a reminder that patriarchal pronatalism is actually the oldest form of population and reproductive control. We know that in country after country, once women achieve the education, empowerment, and means to plan their families, fertility declines. We see that across religious, cultural, and political contexts, that it reveals basically that most women have a desire for lower fertility. There's a very selective focus on rights in the report. All individuals and couples should have the basic right to decide freely and responsibly the number and spacing of their children. But the assumption that women should be spared accurate information about population impacts, really there's no focus on responsibility. Lest they plan their families based on a comprehensive picture of the consequences, not only for themselves, but for present and future societies, for children and for the planet, is condescending. It conveys that people and women in general are not capable of making decisions based on information that's available to them, and that talking about population and climate change and biodiversity loss is somehow trying to indoctrinate people to make more informed decisions. I see that we are running out of time, so I'm going to skip a few slides just to come towards the end here. We know that there are, in terms of the population trends, there are multiple trajectories that are possible, with the extreme swing to the far right and authoritarianism, which includes regressive pronatalism. That's a pathway that we could be taking through forced birth, or through advocating for true reproductive autonomy and responsibility and confronting pronatalism and population denial. That's a possible path. The difference is about 10 billion. In order to really advance social and ecological justice, we must have procreative autonomy free from pronatalism. Our decisions should include our obligations toward potential children. Our decisions should include our obligations toward others and toward our paying attention to ecological and planetary boundaries. We are not separate from nature. We are a part of nature. And this view is what has caused us to be in the situation we're in. Very briefly, the kinds of things that we recommend in our paper, which I deliberately didn't go into detail today in the interest of time, is not only should we be embracing fertility decline, we should be helping to accelerate it, especially in countries and communities where reproductive autonomy has not yet been realized. We should be embracing an aging population rather than ringing alarm bells about it, and modifying policies that treat our elderly with dignity and not as burdens. Our economic models need to be restructured so that our economy is here to serve us and not vice versa. And we must abandon our pretense of human supremacy and embrace an ecocentric worldview that upholds Earth's ecological integrity. I'm sorry I went over time and don't have much time for questions, but I'm going to stop here and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Nandita. That was really fascinating and certainly relevant to the work we do in population studies. Thank you for so eloquently and intentionally diving into the nuance here. Really fantastic presentation. We have a lot of questions and contributions, and so I'm just gonna, in the few minutes we have here, try to answer a few of them. The rest will be answered via email in a follow-up to this presentation, so stay tuned for that. Nandita, the first question I just want to ask you is, and you kind of touched on this broadly, but I want to just, dive in a little bit more. You talked at the beginning of your presentations about what some of the reasons why the UN decided to discontinue talking about population growth as an issue, including most pervasively like coercive population policies. And this is just something that I'm seeing in academic circles as well, is that there's also a lot of attention brought to this broader sort of ideological issue about who is to blame for our environmental crisis. So there's this really sort of intense, like pervasive notion amongst certain populations, again, kind of like Western academic circles, that assert that if we talk about population growth as an issue, that automatically blames the populations that are growing the fastest, which are the poorest and most marginalized populations on Earth. So my first question is, how can we confront this? And I know you kind of talked generally about this, but I'm also wondering if you feel like this is tied into why the UNFPA is framing things in the way that they are. Yeah, if you could just touch on that a little bit.
Yes. Thank you so much. In terms of the UNFPA framing things the way they are, in our paper, we also recognize how many political and ideological forces they are being influenced by. They are not really a apolitical organization. There's a lot of influence from economic actors, from country directors, and also religious advocates of what's okay to talk about, what's not okay to talk about. So I think that's continuing to influence their rhetoric and ideological thinking that is unfortunately not based in science. And then the other question about this notion, and Hannah, you talked about this so wonderfully on our podcast, that this notion that talking about population automatically somehow blames the high fertility countries, and that we should just simply not address it because it's, so many of the problems have been caused by the extractive policies of the richer countries. You captured it really nicely that these narratives are being recycled within these high kind of the post-grad or grad studies, educational institutions within rich countries. And then they are being just recycled across the development agencies, across academia, across media. And the voices, as we saw today, people who are actually self-reporting on what's happening to their livelihoods, to their rights, what's pollution doing to them, what's climate change doing to them. And we know that climate change is going to harm the largest populations who actually live in the most marginalized communities, happen to be the most high fertility countries, the most. And for me to say that, oh, we shouldn't talk about it because it's going to blame somehow automatically, I don't know what automatically means, but somehow blame those countries is so neglectful of what those countries are actually facing today, and that they are at the brunt of the worst ecological impacts. And to say that population growth doesn't matter only from a perspective of emissions, oh, that they're poor people or their consumption is so low, also misses the point that the children that are being born today through coercive pronatalist policies, through lack of choice, children being born to children, are entering into a world of much greater suffering, given where they live. And so even from the perspective of preventing that suffering, for those children, we should be talking about reducing population growth, because it elevates both the reproductive rights and the rights of children.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was a wonderful, wonderful answer. Yeah, exactly. I think that if we look at what's going on in really high fertility countries, juxtaposed against climate change, it's very clear that population growth is, as you said, causing more suffering and something that needs to be immediately addressed from both human rights and ecological perspectives. What about kind of related to this kind of broader theme of if we should talk about population issues or not, another kind of argument against talking about population studies is that, oh, well, actually our population is decelerating and declining. And what about the prediction by the UN and other agencies that the Earth's population will likely plateau at 11 billion people? And that will also cause not only, well, it will ultimately cause economic collapse, right? So what's the kind of answer to that?
Yeah, so first of all, the 11 billion is not baked in. We could end up with 6 or 7 billion if we actually started to accelerate the decline in fertility rates by confronting a lot of this denial, and confronting pronatalism, and confronting this notion that economic growth is the be-all, end-all of prosperity. We have had so many guests talking about the notion that this obsession with GDP growth is actually not a good strategy for poverty reduction, because so many people would use that to say, well, it's to help the poor. Well, the money mostly ends up lining up the pockets of the elites and the wealthy. It's not trickling down to the poor. And the second aspect, that it's solving itself is very problematic, because that notion that it's solving itself has what led to complacency in so many liberal circles around talking about reproductive rights. Most progressives will say, what are you talking about? Population is not an issue. Haven't you heard? Fertility is an all-time low. Well, fertility rates should be declining a lot more. Population could be reduced a lot more if fertility rates through advancement of reproductive rights were actually realized. And we could be at a lot lower number with far fewer people in harm's way if we were to address that. And lastly, ecological collapse, not economic collapse, is what we should be worried about. And that is underway.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And I think that's a nice place to end. We've got a lot of questions that have, again, been unanswered, but we will get back to you via email with answers to each question. So thank you for submitting them. Thank you so much, Nandita. This was a fantastic presentation. And thanks all of you who joined in today. It's been nice to get to engage in discussion with you all.
Thanks so much for having me. This was wonderful. And please get in touch with me if you do have questions individually, and I will respond in writing to the questions that we didn't get to today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.